Hello. This is the first video in the series about how to create endless runner in Unity. We're going to do this as 2D project. So start your Unity hub. I'm using Unity 6 for this. You can use any other version, but it will be some differences in code. So click create new project, universal 2D. Let's name it just runner. Set location. I'm not using connect to the Unity Cloud because we are not going to use any functionality of this. And click create project. It will take a few minutes to start project, but while this is happening, we can prepare our assets for our character. So there is the website called Game Dev Market. So you would need to register here, and there is a lot of free assets. So I'm going here to the assets, and I'm interested in characters. So click here. Uh, Something wrong with the HTTPS, but wonder what's happened. Let's try to refresh the page. Or let's try to open it in the new tab. Maybe it will work. Okay, so this one is loaded. So I can select now only free assets. I'm going to click here free, click update, and it should show me only free assets. So you can select any which you like. I'm going to use this one. So I already ordered it. So it said that I already have in my library, but here will be button something like buy. You would need to buy, it's free. And then you would be able to download. So I can click here, I can click download. I can save it on the desktop. So now we have this here. I can extract it. Extract. And we have assets. For now, we need only idle, so I'm going to import to Unity only idle, but later we would need other. To assets, I'm going to create new folder. Let's call it images. And now I simply need to drag this idle to Unity. So now I can open this and I have my assets. So if I add any, you see it's too small and it's too blurry, so it's not what we want. So we need to modify our image. So I click here on the idle, and there are a few settings which need to be changed. First, disable compression to make image more crisp, and also we need to set filter mode to point no filter. And now it looks like a pixel art. But it's still too small, so we need to increase the size by specifying pixel per unit. You can play with the value. What would you like? I tried like 32, and I think it looks a bit small, so I can probably try 24. I think this size is fine. But also we have here not one image, but 5. We need to cut them. So I can click here, open sprite editor. And right now Unity tried to cut them automatically, but this can cause us some problems in future, so we need to cut it manually. So I can click here slice, and there is few options. First is automatic, then grid by size, grid by cell count. I think in this case it will be easier to cut by slice by cell count. So we have one column and 4 rows. So one column and 4 rows. Oh, my bad. Like this. 4 column and 1 row. And it's split it evenly. So now I can click the slice. Slice, make sure you click apply. And now we can close this. So here will be our character. And let's start by creating new game object. So I'm going to delete it. So let's start by creating the character. So here in the sample scene, I can click my right mouse of the button and I can start with the empty object. And let's call it player. So we would need to add few components. Right now it has only transform. This is the default component which is responsible for player, like for the object location. And this is component which cannot be deleted. Any other components can be removed. And let's start by adding sprite renderer because we want our player to be visible. So I can click here, add component, and I'm going to type here sprite and select sprite render. So there is some options which we not going to use right now. What we are interested in sprite. So I can click here, or I can just simply drag or select from the list. So here is our player. But right now, if I start the game, nothing could happen because this is the only image. There is no physics, no collision, nothing. So, but we want for our player to be able to move and jump. So we need to add another component, which is called rigid body, which is responsible for physics in for this particular game object. So once I added physics and I can, if I start the game, object immediately will fall down because there is the gravity, which is applied to our object. So now we can try to create some ground for player to stand. I can choose again right mouse button to as to the object sprite and let's create square. So it will be just simple square sprite. So but I can add it like this. But again, if I start the game, player would still fall down because like this is just the image. So there is no collision happening. So we need to add additional component, which is called collision. We need to add it to the both. So let's start from the square. So if I type here new component, collision, collider, we can have, you see there is the multiple. We're creating 2D game, so we need box collider 2D. So if I added this box collider, I immediately got this green line. So this is our collider. So now even if I have no sprite enabled, a player would collide with this and won't fall. But before that, we need to also add collider to our player because again, if I run the game, player would fall down because there is collider added on ground. Let's change the color to something like green, like grass. But player also need collider. So here, let's go to the player. Let's add collider. Again, type collider. And for player, I think it makes sense to use Capsule Collider 2D, but it's too big because if I open here, Sprite Editor, you see this image is quite big. So Collider is created for whole image. We need to make it smaller. There is the button, which is called Edit Collider. I can click it and I can change the size of the collider. So let's make it something like smaller. Let's zoom it to not to cover most of the player. And I think this looks good. So now if I run the game, player would not fall through the ground. This looks good, but our player is not moving, not jumping, anything is happening, nothing is happening. So we need to start by adding script. How to create script. But first, let's start from new folder where scripts will be located. So let's create folder scripts and let's start again. Right button, create. There is the scripting mono behavior script. Click here and let's name it player. So it's created the player and you need to make sure that file name is match class name here because like for example, if I rename the file, but I would keep here name player, Unity will complain and won't work. So now we have player, but we need to add this script, which is component to our player. So I can just drag it here and you see we have the player. So now let's open it. I'm using JetBrains Rider, but you can use like Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, any editor which you prefer. So this is what we have. This is the empty script where we have start and update method. Start method is executed when game is just started. And update method is executed every frame of the game. There is some additional built-in methods in Unity, such as awake, um, fix update, but we will use them later. Right now, we want for player to be able to move and jump. So for this, we need to introduce few variables because there should be speed with which player should move and uh, how high player should jump. So let's define two variables. We're going to create them here globally inside of the class, not inside of the method. And there is two possibilities. This can be public or it can be private. If you are creating variable public, it means it can be accessed from other like scripts or other classes. But if it's private, it can be used only from inside of this script. So we are going to use both of them, but for speed and jump height, we are going to use public because they may be changed from the outside of the player script. So let's type public. Now we need to provide type. So it can be like string if this is the text value. It can be the integer. There is many other, but we are going to use float. It means that this is number with dot. So let's call it move speed. This is the name, move speed. And we can here set some default value. So let's start with like 5f. And I needed to use f because this indicates this is the float. And another which we are going to use, and it's automatically proposed for me, jump speed. Let's start also with 5m. So now we have those two variables, and if we get back to the Unity and select our player, you see that they available here inside of the inspector. This is because those variables are public. If I change this to the private, let's try it. So let's change this to the private and save. You will see that it's no longer present here, so only jump speed left. But there is the also way to show private variables. We are going to use that. And just to make everything looks nicer, we can use header annotation. So I can, in the square brackets, I can type here header and call it movement. So what this will do, so if I get back to the Unity, you see there is the header movement. And we can separate our variables using those headers. So now we need somehow player to move. And what is responsible for movement is the rigid body. So rigid body can, like, because it's using the physics, it can add velocity to our player. But somehow we need to access this rigid body component. Uh, to use this, we need this time private variable. Let's private. And type would be rigid body 2D. And let's call it RB. But right now it's empty. So it do not have any reference to our existing rigid body which we have attached to the player. So we need to retrieve it. Usually this can be done in start or awake method. So how can be done? So in start we can type rb get component rigid body 2D. So it will search for this component on our player, and if it found, it will assign it to this variable. So now once we have it, we can do movement. So there is the linear velocity parameter of rigid body, and we can specify how player need to be moved. And for Unity in movement, we are using vector 2. How can we do it? So we need to create new instance of the class. So there is the keyword new, which we need to use, and we need to type vector 2. And what we are doing here, we are applying, so vector 2 has two parameters, x and y. You see, x and y. This is the position of the player. Not the player, but coordinate. So inside of the vector 2, we are specifying first as the move speed. This is with which speed player moving. And for y, Yes, we are just taking existing position, but there is the you can specify it like this, linear velocity y. So this is existing value of the player without changing it. Because if we set this to the 0, it won't work because it will always reset position on y to the 0 and jump wouldn't work here. So we are just taking from existing rigid body, we are just taking existing velocity. So we are not changing it. And now let's start the game and player should automatically move. So, but as you see, it's fall down. Why? Because it has enabled rotation on the Z. So if you inside of the region body, there is the constraint, we can freeze rotation on the Z axis. So that's what we need to do to prevent from our player to falling down. So now let's put our player here. Let's start. And it should move. So right now we don't have any animation, we don't have any jumping, but let's add jumping now. So we want to jump every time when player press some button. So there is the two input system in the Unity, old one, it's legacy, and new one. But for our game is pretty simple and control is also pretty simple, so it makes sense to use here old Unity input system. So how can we check what can we do here? So there is, if you click edit and project setting, there is the input manager and input system. So this is the new input system, and like, so if you want to use new input system, you would use this. But for input manager, this is the old one. And here is the axis. So you see there is a lot of predefined like horizontal, which has button left and right. There is the vertical, which has button down, up, and SW. So we can use that. And we have here which is called jump. So that's what we are going to use for jump. We are going to use this because it has like space, and also if you're using the controller, it automatically has configured button. But how can we do that? It's pretty simple. So inside of the Unity, we need to use condition. So condition check if like button, for in our case, we're going to use button. So it will check if button is pressed, it will do some action. If button is not pressed, no action is done. But condition is used in many other places, and every condition should return true or false. So if true is returned, condition evaluated as true and action is executed. But if false returned, nothing happened. So how to do condition? So we can type if, and in brackets, we can do we can use input. This is the class static class name from the Unity. And here we are going to use get button. Get button, and let's type here jump. So it will just use this button, which we saw here previously in the setting. So, but if you type here something like jump to or something like else, it won't work because there is no axis configured. And how to jump? We're going to use similar approach. So I'm just copy this line, linear velocity, but this time for x, we are going to keep linear velocity x because we're going to take existing linear velocity of the player. We're not going to change it. But here, let's add jump speed. And jumping is done. But we have a problem. Let's see. So if I start the game, so I can click jump, but I can, and as you can see, I can click jump as many times as I want, and player would fly. So this is not what we want. So we need to check if player is touching the ground, and only in this case we would jump. But before we can do it, we need to add some additional settings for our ground. Let's rename it to the ground, not to be a square ground. So here we have the layers. So we can check collision with some of the layers. Right now it's on default layer and everything on default layer. So what we can do, click here, add layer, and let's define new layer called ground. So we are going to use ground to check if player can jump. So it means if player is colliding, is touching this ground, we allow him to jump. So this is the first. Next, we need to do inside of the script. So let's back to the script, and we need to add parameter which will be Boolean type, and it will be private and Boolean. Boolean can have two values, true or false. So we're going to use is grounded, and by default it has value false because we are not assigning any value. So we are going to change it to true if player is touching the ground. But to do that, we need some additional parameters. So let's create, all of them would be private. And next one, type would be layer mask. This is what we created. And let's call it ground mask. And final, we need to be float. And this is like for how far from our player ground should be to allow jumping. So let's call it something like check ground distance. So now we have three variables, but we need them to be available from the inspector, because right now, because we want to change the values inside the inspector, right now there is nothing. So there is the also attribute which we can add, which is called serialize field, which is expose those parameters from inside of the inspector. So now if I back here, so they still are private, but they available here. But also I think, and let's check, let's add serialized fields is grounded just for testing purposes. And let's add header and call it something like collision. Collision. So now we have these three parameters available from inside of the Unity. So is grounded, ground mask. So for ground mask, we need to select this layer, which we assigned our ground to. So you see it's ground. So inside of the player, I'm clicking here and I'm selecting the same ground. So it will be checking uh, like where we collide. Next, we need to tune this check ground distance. But right now it's very hard to tune. There will be like ray coming from the inside of the player from this position to the bottom, and we need to know the distance of it to check. So we need somehow to visualize it. So what we can do, we can add additional method in Unity on draw gizmos. So this method is executed only when we are like developing game. It never executed when we have final project. So how can we do it? We're going to use here class gizmos, draw a line, draw line, and here we need to specify from which location we are going to uh, draw this line. So it will be transform dot position, and we need to draw this line to the bottom. So we are going to use vector to down and multiply it on the check ground distance. So now let's go to the Unity. Let's run the game and see what we got. Okay, looks like I did something wrong. Because you see this is ray is coming into not the right location. So let's change this a bit. Let's add here new vector. We're going to use new vector 2. New vector. Why it's want for me to use. So let's use new vector 2. And here I'm going to use add as editor proposed, but we need to so first we're going to check position player of X, then we're going to check position player of Y, and we need to minus check ground distance. So let's see how it will work. So if I start the game, but we need to prevent player from moving. So let's deal with that first. This is the endless running game. So there is player don't need to run any button to start the game. So we need to create new variable, which would be public, also type of the bool. And how should we name it? Which will identify if the run is started. Let's call it run started. So by default, it has false. So now here inside of the update, we want to enable to allow jumping only if the run started. So if I type like here, it's the same if I will specify it's equal to true, but it is not really required. So I can just type here, if run started, we want to run. So right now, if I run the game, because this is the false, because we're not assigning here any value, player will not run. Let's run it. So yeah, player is not moving. Now we can play with this value, which we have, check ground distance. So you see, if I'm increasing, this line is appearing from the inside of the player, and we need to check if it's touching the ground. But just do not use too high value, because what if, for example, player is here and line is touching, it will allow him to jump. So it needs to touch the ground only when player is standing on the ground. So let's use minimum possible value. So I'm going to use 1.2. But because I did these changes here inside when game was started, it nothing happened, but I can really do here. So let's type it 1.2. And now we can identify like when player is grounded to allow the jump. So let's do it. So here inside of the update, I'm going to use is grounded. And for this, I'm going to use class called physics2d and a method raycast. So there is multiple overrides of the raycast method. So which we are going to use. First, we need to specify position of the from where this array is going to where is the beginning of the array. So in the same what we did with the draw line. Next, we need to specify array where array is going to be casted. And in our case, this is the down, because we want to check if it's down. Next, we need to specify length of this array. That's why we have this check ground distance. And finally, we want to specify the mask, because if if I'm not going to specify mask, it will check collision with everything. So if it's enemy or ground or water or anything, it will detect this collision and set is grounded to true. So now let's try to run the game and see if the value is grounded is changing based on the collision. So right now, this is grounded is true. But if I jump, you see, it's getting false. And our jump is working, but I still can jump a lot because we haven't we are not using this is grounded. So how can we use it? So inside here, if input get button jump, we also need to check if player is on the ground. So we are checking if button is pressed and player on the ground. So I'm going to use double ampersand sign and is grounded. So how it will work? So first it will check if button is pressed. If button is pressed, this will return true. So it will look like this. Next, it will check if is grounded. And if is grounded is true, all condition will be true. You see, expression is always true, and this will be executed. But if is grounded false, it never would be executed because both of them need to be true. So now, final thing which we need to do is to somehow start the game. And we can do it again pressing something. Just let's add here if input get button, and we're going to use button fire. So if someone clicked fire one, if someone clicked left mouse of the button, game would be started. So I will check run started to true. So what we are doing here, so if fire one is clicked, this value become true and players start running. But I think it makes sense to move those to the separate method. So I can do show contact, like I can create new method from this. So I'm going to create new method, and hand is proposed me some name handle, but I think I'm going to delete in just handle input. So next, so what's happened here? Let's move it at the top. New method was created, just code which we have previously was moved here in the new method, which is called handle input, and here we are executing handle input. So that's all for today's video. Let's just verify if everything works as expected. So when I start the game, player is not moving, nothing is happening. Then I click left mouse, it started to running, and I can jump. So that's all. In next videos, we are going to work on animation and other functionality. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.